Thank you so much for the introduction to the introduction. I really appreciate it. Congratulations to all of you awardees. And it's a great honor to introduce Cynthia Solomon here at CrossRoads. Cynthia has been asked to be the inaugural speaker for the Seymour Papert Memorial Lecture. And many of you know some of the reasons why she is the person to take on that job tonight. Since I've known Cynthia for a long time, I'm here to tell you about some adventures that we've had that you might not know that have led in surprising directions. Seymour wrote in the acknowledgement section of his book Mindstorms, Solomon was the first to develop an intellectually coherent methodology for training teachers to introduce children to computers. And she is still one of the few people to have approached this problem with the seriousness that it deserves. That's what Seymour wrote. So I'm sure that you've seen that Cynthia designed the logo programming language for children with Seymour and a few others at BBN and MIT, and that you've seen her papers that show the how and the why of many of the early program explorations with children. And her leadership of the seminal Atari Cambridge Laboratory in the 1980s, which there are many stories about, you can ask us, it was quite a fun place. And her books, including Computer Environments for Children, which is terrific, and many of you have probably read. Okay, now slide. Could I have the slide? Please. Here's Cynthia when she was a teenager on her beloved horse. She is a really devoted horse person and a great rider. And in fact, in 1972, the entire Logo laboratory shipped a giant computer to Exeter, England to show off Logo at a conference. And I was fortunate to be able to go with them while I was a high school student. I was a Logo teacher to the middle school students there. And I remember it as a tremendous immersive technical experience, and it was a watershed in public knowledge that programming could be for kids, 1972. But I most remember Cynthia saying, "Let's go find the horses." So off we went, horse riding on the moors of England. Cynthia works from a place of intuition. When someone works intuitively, they also still have to put in the perspiration part too, the hours of programming, the hours of careful video editing, preparing plans for class projects, lectures, and writing notes on what went well and what went unexpectedly. And the point, Cynthia still honors her intuition. She lets herself react quickly to what seems good and what doesn't. What seems as though it will lead to a project and what seems like it wouldn't be interesting. She senses who and what would be good to collect to make a project shine and what wouldn't be a good fit. So when you're good at making decisions quickly and intuitively, you also need to be good at debugging later. And Cynthia has always emphasized that the joy of debugging and the skills for debugging are a deeply important part of the culture of computing. One of Cynthia's intuitions back around 1960, when computation was almost unknown anywhere, and she was a history major at Harvard, was that it would be good to get into these things called computers. It was a flash of intuition. And she found her way to my father, Marvin Minsky's new Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at MIT. And through her job there, she learned programming, she met Seymour Papert, and she worked on what became Logo and its vision. I am so grateful to call Cynthia my friend. Her work and life are entwined with that intuitive start to her career when she was just out of college. And I'm deeply grateful for the friendship and collaboration that developed between my father and Cynthia, and a lot of fun that came with that. On behalf of CrossRoads and all of us, educators, learners, makers, and thinkers here, I'm honored to welcome Cynthia Solomon.
Thank you, that was fabulous. Okay. I can't see you. I was just walking around the room to see if you can see this and see that. And I see that you can see those things because I'm going to show you slides and videos. And I wanted, if you couldn't see, I was going to say, come on over in this side. But anyway, I cased the room, and it's okay. And I am so honored to be here tonight to share with you some of my experiences in creating a programming language for children. The work started a while ago. Logo. And last year, people said it was the 50th anniversary of that programming language. In fact, it was the 51st. But I'm going to give you some history. So this is a tribute to Seymour. And the question that was in my mind when I was putting together this presentation is why? And I hope that from what I show you and talk about, you'll agree that you have an answer for why. In fact, what I'm going to show you is a piece of Seymour. This is a video that represents why I would follow him, and that I see people here. There's Mark Miller, who was a graduate student of his in the 70s. Sorry. And Mark still works with computers and children, which is wonderful. And so here is a sample of Seymour. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not really, yeah, good. I can't seem to connect well, but okay, there it goes. Oh, that's why. I'm sorry. Does somebody want a flash? There was a problem. This is not my computer. My computer, they couldn't find. I don't know whether you'll help. You'll make me nervous. Okay, go away. Sorry. I'll get it going in a second. We may be here all night. Why isn't this working?
I'd like to imagine a country in which they use Roman numerals. You know that stuff like 5 is V and 6 is VI and 500 is, when you never can remember what 500 is, something like M, and 600 something like MC, and then LI, you know, that sort of stuff. if you've ever tried to do this, you'd be interesting to do it. And try to multiply two numbers in Roman numerals. It's extremely difficult. And so difficult that in those days, in reality, when they did really use Roman numerals, being able to do operations like multiplication were regarded as a highly specialized, difficult thing that only a few people could do. Now, in my story, let's imagine a country where they use these Roman numerals, but people have begun to be worried, for whatever reason, that so few people seem to be able to learn to do operations with numbers. So there are two schools of thought about what to do about it. One school of thought says, well, we've got to fix our school system. We'll have better tests. We'll make movies. We'll make video games about how to put IX in front of XI. We'll make movies about it. The kids make movies, all sorts of stuff like that. I'm sure all those things that we do all the time, the people who try to improve our schools do all the time, would produce some improvement. But a much bigger improvement came from a different direction. The invention of what we now call Arabic, which we should already call Hindu-Arabic numerals, made a radical change, because all of a sudden, by inventing and doing it in a different way, in fact doing a different arithmetic, they could all of a sudden, what required long years of specialized training for only a small number of experts, now most people in the society could multiply and add. At any rate, that could be put out as a goal. And that's the perspective that I want to have. Could we have that kind of change in our education system? Not comparable to getting a little bit of a few extra points on the test, but really changing on the model of something like going from Roman to our Hindu-Arabic kind of numerals. We might notice some of the difficulties that those people trying to introduce the new kind of numbers might have had. For example, the kids would fail the tests because the tests are all about is MIX bigger or smaller than MXI? And students who were learning about 1, 2, 3, 9, 9, 0, 4, 1.
So that's a piece of Seymour, and why I could follow him. He was a great leader in making your imagination work. So his big radical idea was to create a computer language designed for children. And what I'm going to be talking about is the history of creating that language, which I was part of. I just wanted to remind you folks of what it was like. This was in 1966, 65, 66, early 60s. A computer, there it is. There weren't any laptops. There weren't any desktops. There weren't any display terminals. There was a display. It was attached, as you see, to the computer. You had to get, in those days, you had to get permission to go into the computer room. It was, this is a small computer. It's a PDP-11. That's small. Huh? No, you think it was a PD? I don't think so. Anyway, they all look alike, you know, those PDPs. I wanted to give you a sense of Seymour's history with regard to thinking about children. And so in 1959-64, Seymour worked with Piaget in Geneva. Jean Piaget was the famous genetic epistemologist who studied children, who told us that children have knowledge. You don't have to, they're not empty vessels. They think about things. And in 1964, he left Geneva and arrived at the MIT AI Lab, sorry. And in 1965, he began consulting at both Beranek and Newman with Danny Barbro and Wally Feuerzag, and started Logo. Danny had been a graduate student at the MIT AI Lab, a student of Marvin's and Seymour. Seymour helped him in the last phases of his doctoral work. And so Dan became head of the AI group at BBN and hired Seymour as a consultant. In 1969, the Logo group was started at MIT. So here is Marvin and Seymour. I love this picture of them. They were, at that time, what Seymour was focusing on was making machines think, advising students, and working with Marvin on machine vision and robotics. And see, I was there. I met Marvin in 1962. I became his secretary, because what else did a modern woman do who wanted to learn about computers? And then I met Seymour in his first visit to MIT in '63, and finally in '64 he came permanently. And this was a party for Halloween at the AI Lab, and guess who was there with me? Little Margaret Minsky. and in 1965, I joined Wally Feuerzag's education tech group at BBN. So I got educated by Marvin in the AI Lab and his graduate students. I learned to program in Lisp, and then I went as a Lisp programmer to BBN. So Seymour's big idea was derived from the work he did with Marvin on making computers intelligent, from his work with Piaget on children as theory builders and constructors of their own knowledge. They weren't dumb. They did think differently than adults, but what was interesting is to watch the evolution of that thinking as they became adults. And it was from observation, from experience and accumulation of knowledge. And his observations, Seymour's observations of children using a programming language designed for adults, because that's all there was in those days. So, a computer language created for children. It was a great idea, but it took over a decade to mature. And that's what I'm going to show you as I was part of that journey. When Seymour consulted at BBN, he visited some classes. BBN had Wally was involved in a project where children were using Telcomp, which was an algebraic programming language, an interpreter, unlike BASIC, which was you had to compile before the code would run. And Seymour saw the struggles that the kids were going through to use this algebraic language to learn algebra. So he said, we need a language for children. And here's the team. There's Seymour, me, Danny Barbro, and Wally Feuerzag. So in 1966, Wally and Dan and Seymour had conversations in the spring speccing out a language. And in that summer, Seymour fully specced out the language and came back and presented it to us, and actually in Danny Barbro's living room. And that night, Dan started implementing logo in Lisp. It hadn't a name. It was called Ghost at first. Dan liked that name. Wally didn't, and Wally chose Logo, which is certainly a better name. So by 1967, there was a version. It ran on a timeshare. Do you all know about timesharing? That picture I showed you was of a time-shared computer. Now, BBN's time-shared computer, one of them at the time was an SDS 940, and that's the one that Lisp ran on so beautifully, and Logo ran in Lisp. And in that summer, Seymour taught a class of children at the Hanscom Air Force Base, and Wally and I were observers. And what happened, we used teletypes, and that's print from a teletype. What happened is, by the end of that, I think it was a 2-week summer class meeting every day, Logo got totally revised. And that was the standard. Every time we worked with children, a new version of Logo emerged. And so, in 1968, a new version of Logo was running on a PDP-1, time-shared. There were 14 teletypes. I don't know if you know what a teletype is, but it's a big clunker that was used by Western Union in particular. And we had some that were upper and lowercase, but most of them were only uppercase. And we selected a group of children in the average range. There were 14 of them, so we had 14. Oh yeah, I've got a funny story to tell you. Seymour and Wally wrote a proposal and sent it to the Department of Education at the time. I think it was the department, it could have been office. And they went to Washington to talk to them about getting the funding. And the person's name was Oddie, and Seymour in later years often talked about Oddieisms. Because what this guy wanted to know is why 14 terminals? Where's your chi-square factor? Where's a few other things? And Seymour told him, if you were in my class, I'd flunk you. Seymour didn't get mad very often, but about that he did. Anyway, I was not going to be a teacher with this class. We had hired a wonderful woman who was a math teacher and really a wonderful person. She had never really worked with computers and had no idea about project-based learning. So I was away for a while, and when I came back, I visited the class and was pretty shocked. What she was doing is she was teaching syntax, which was cute and nice, and kids seemed to like it, but what was the point? And Seymour and Wally were observing and said nothing, and that got me even more annoyed. Why did I have to be the one to point out to them that this wasn't a good road to take? So it ended up with me taking over and making Seymour promise to team teach with me. So the class was 4 days a week in computer math, that's what it was called, instead of the regular math class. And Seymour came out 2 days a week, and I was there 4 days a week. And the kinds of things we did were project-based. The first thing we did was not an interesting project to me, but Pig Latin. And my rule with the kids is if they wanted to play a game, they had to write it. So we did NIM, And as an example of a program. We did talk about tic-tac-toe and strategies with games, and they didn't like me because I discussed with them how tic-tac-toe has a non-winning strategy. It ruined the game for them for a while. And, so here's, oh yeah. So the underlying ideas for this were procedural thinking. Logo was a procedural programming language. It took after Lisp. Debugging was the priority. Project-based learning, talking about what you're doing, giving things names so you could talk about them, and having objects to play with. And we also thought of procedures as little people doing work. Today, you might think of them as agents. We didn't have that idea at the time, but they were little people, and they had various things like you. You could identify with your programs and talk about your bugs as well as the program's bugs. So here's Seymour without his beard. Now, one of the things we did was sentence generators. And the kids talked about sentences being made up of nouns and verbs. And so that would be a good idea for categorizing and putting together a sentence. And we talked about adjectives too. But the thing is, when their first sentence generator programs were totally gobbledygook. Why? Because they put verbs and adjectives in the nouns collection and the nouns in the verbs collection and so on. And so you hear them when they finally realize what they did saying, oh, that's why they call them nouns and verbs. Anyway, this led to the next thing, which was generating math equations, which they got very good at solving. By the way, one of the things that happened, there was a math specialist who'd been bugging me to visit. And I finally said, okay, come and visit. And they were doing sentence generators. And she ran out of the classroom, pulling her hair, screaming, where is their math? So I found that interesting, and it was indicative of a lot of people who couldn't think outside the box, that in fact this is doing real mathematics, and it continues. Anyway, Logo became the name of a programming language, of an environment, and the environment had people, ideas, and things in it, and a culture, a way of thinking about computers and about learning and putting the two together. So in the summer of 1969, Seymour and I left BBN, and the Logo group started at MIT. I mean, Seymour was already at MIT, and so why Logo? Well, the first thing is children needed their own computer language. Features of Logo that were important for us were that it focused on playing with words and sentences. In fact, numbers were special kinds of words. And also, we built dedicated time-shared environments, so the kids didn't have to worry about logging in and saving their work and retrieving their work. It was all tied into the system. It wasn't like using DOS, where you had to know about file systems. And the projects could be divided into procedures, and procedures could be debugged separately from the whole. And again, emphasis on naming, and things could have very long names. So here's a little blurb of Marvin talking about.
And one of the troubles with education theory until recently is that people had this idea that the best way to learn is to make it a positive experience. Everything should be good. The child should be guided to make very small steps so that they can't make any serious mistakes, and then you learn everything, and when you're all done, you can do the job without thinking because you know exactly what to do. Well, I don't think that kind of learning leads to becoming very good at new problems because you haven't learned enough about bugs. So what we've really got to do is to teach children to enjoy being wrong.
Now, the first public presentation of Logo was in 1970, and this great poster was made called Teaching Children Thinking, and Seymour wrote a wonderful paper afterwards called Teaching Children Thinking, and you'd all enjoy reading it. Anyway, at the conference took place at MIT in a room that held 700 people, and it was full. Seymour came out, and this was, he gave incredible presentations. Anyway, he came out and jumped on a table and had a broom in one hand and a ruler in the other hand and said, which is easier to balance, a broom or a ruler? And the audience, well, there were physicists in the audience, said, of course, a ruler. So Seymour demonstrated how difficult it is to balance a ruler compared to a broom. Anyway, because we were at the AI lab, a lot of things could be done. All of the AI lab was full of incredible hackers, incredible graduate students, and incredible staff members, all ready to do Seymour and Marvin's suggestions. Maybe not the way they wanted them to be, but their suggestions. The AI lab's philosophy was based on Marvin's philosophy, which is you really trust people. And you believe that people who are there are thinkers. That's the same thing that we thought about children, that they think. So Seymour and I team taught again, some fifth graders this time, in 1970, 71. And then we had 2 floor turtles. That was the outcome of the work with 7th graders. Seymour said, we definitely need something more concrete that they can identify with, and that's how turtles came to be. But turtles got built. The yellow turtle Marvin found the shell of it was found in the dumps, DOD dump center in Taunton, Massachusetts. Marvin haunted that place and found lots of equipment there. And the other turtle was built in the lab. And the other thing we had was a display turtle. And you can see the young man pointing to it. What there was there was a supernova, a general turtle supernova, refreshing the screen. And all of this ran over phone lines back to the PDP-10 at MIT. So, and here's another example. Children got to call that spiraling effect squiral, even though whether it was a triangular spiral or a square spiral. Here's the kind of video, graphics. And here's a video, the kind of video we had in 1970. I mean, animation, animation. So now here is Seymour This was made by a local television station.
Let a child learn mathematics by speaking in mathematics about things that really matter to them. So at MIT, we've given computers the power to turn motors, to make sounds, to draw pictures, and we've found ways of giving children the power to control the computer. Now they'll put their little tubes together to make bigger ones.
Sometimes I get into bugs like this, and it'll, when it was doing it in his mind, the little turtle, the little triangle thing, was on an angle, so it drew the picture on an angle.
A computer-controlled turtle is made to draw and dance by programs so simple that all children invent them in the first days of the course. Thus the child acquires a taste for math power that grows and grows as his projects become more original, more complex, and more varied.
Marvin,
Let a child...
well, sorry.
Let a child...
Stop. One of Marvin's many contributions to the logo development was a four-voice music box. For him, it was trivial. For us, it was a miracle. And it was used for many years. We only had one until you didn't need a music box. Little apples and oranges and so on could produce music. So again, the logo environment was made up of a lot of things. But the interesting thing for me, and the thing that Seymour and I worked on a lot together, was a kind of meta language. How do you talk about what you're doing? For instance, we refuse to use variable because variable. See, Marvin would call variable a suitcase word. It had so many meanings, and we wanted things to be clearer. And so it was that kind of thing that he and I went through a lot. The other thing that was interesting in a logo environment was the relationship between teacher and learner. Sometimes you couldn't tell who was the teacher and who was the learner. And I never worked with a group of kids that I didn't learn from. And I also didn't know the answers. And we worked on them together. And that's a whole different, today it's not as foreign as it was when we were first starting. And then we also wanted to extend out in the world. So there were sort of bridging activities that you could procedurize. For example, we taught kids to walk on stilts. Push down, pull up. That was a very key phrase. You know, with your feet you push down, with your arms you pull up, and you can manage to walk. We did juggling with them, which was very procedural. Seymour and I also learned to ride unicycles, he better than me. And fortunately, we didn't bring those into the classroom. we were searching for things. And Seymour was a fabulous cook, and we never got to do it together, to teach kids some cooking strategies. So here's Seymour on a bongo board, and you know who pushing him. So we did bring this to the school, and that was kind of fun. I have a video of my little 8-year-old nephew who couldn't balance, but I'm not showing it to you today. And then the next big event was, and Margaret mentioned it because she was part of it, we went to a conference, a math education conference in Exeter, England. And Exeter is in Exmoor, in the moors. And Digital Equipment Corporation had sold a PDP-1 to the University of Exeter, and we had just developed a new version of logo on a PDP-1. And the developer had also copied these graphics terminals that were built for the AI lab, but adopted them to be Turtle graphics terminals. And so 4 of them went over, and Turtles and the Music Box and us. And we set up 3 or 4 weeks before the conference. We worked with British children in Exeter, England. And we had a blast. And so did the kids. I forgot to, anyway, one of the things I warned them about was during the conference, they were there to demonstrate to the participants of the conference. And I warned them that they had to be patient with people that came to visit who would ask them questions. And one of the things that the teachers or the educators would come and ask the kids questions thinking they wouldn't be able to answer them and being really annoyed that they could, and that the educators had no idea what the answers were themselves. So I had clued them in a little bit to be patient. And it happened with the 7th graders. We had a public display where people would ask the question, and as the kids were answering and demoing, the teacher or the person would walk away. So, and people would say, oh, Papert can teach people anything. And then they found out Papert didn't do the teaching. Margaret was my teaching assistant, and she was, you know, a kid. And we then it was said I gave them candy, and that's how they learned. If only that were true, I would have had a big bag of candy. So the upshot of this was we started a company called General Turtle. Marvin, Seymour, me, and some other people. Seymour's brother, who was an engineer. And the intention was to make floor turtles available to the world. However, Marvin was part of the company, and he decided what we really needed was a logo computer that had turtle graphics. And so the 2500 came to be born, and
This machine is called the 2500, and basically it's a small, very powerful computer which has built into it hardware to run 2 kinds of displays. This is the central processor, which is the computer itself. This is a display which shows printed material, and you can use several kinds of fonts. In fact, you can design your own type font, and it can do a limited amount of picture displaying ability. And this is called a vector scope, which can show pictures made of lines and curves and points, and can show pictures that move quite rapidly, and any kind of animation that you can program. I'd like to introduce Professor Seymour Papert of MIT, who developed the programming language that we use for this kind of animation.
That was Professor Marvin Minsky who designed and built this machine. I'm going to show you how simple it is to write some pictures in the language that we've developed for children and other people.
okay, well, what happened, oh, here's an example of the kind of graphics that you could, it was a vector graphics display, so the kind of movement you could get was really interesting. Now, this was 1975, and it was just about the time that the Homebrew computing movement started. Marvin was thrilled because this computer system only cost $5,000. PDP-11, which is what high schools were buying, was hundreds of thousands of dollars. So this was a big breakthrough. But another big, so the 2500 kind of didn't stay with the school movement. It got supplanted by computers that were sort of personal. They were developing into personal computers. Now, one of the major breakthroughs for Logo was the TI 99/4, which was a home computer that had a sprite board in it. And that sprite board is the same sprite board that's used today. This sprite board gave us, in 1979, 30 sprites, or 30 turtles. And the turtles could write in colors. And that was a major breakthrough. So that's why I have that picture. In 1981, Logo Computer Systems started up, which included me and Marvin and a couple of people in this audience, and Seymour and other people. And the goal of that was to get Logo out on these laptops. And the first one was Apple Logo. So Logo Computer Systems became a Canadian company, and Brian Silverman, who's in the audience, was responsible for many versions of Logo after this one. But this one was developed in Boston. And the next venture I had was the folks that worked with me in the Boston office of Logo Computer Systems joined me when Alan Kay, who Seymour often said was the only other person at that time who was focused on children's thinking and computing for children. I mean, he wanted his intention when he was at doing his research at Park was to design a computer and a computer language for children. He also had to fight the Xerox people who were more interested in adults. But he set up a research lab. He became chief scientist at Atari, and he set up a Cambridge research lab. And so Margaret Minsky was there with me, and there I go again. I am sorry, folks. No, you have to bear with me. I am, as I told you.
Our research has been motivated by our past experiences in the Logo group at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, where we worked with Seymour Papert and Marvin Minsky. We looked at ways to control computers through gestures, by touch, and by gross body movement. We designed an object-oriented logo and developed applications in it. We built several mechanical devices to add new dimensions to computing environments. We began to build tools toward a musical PlayStation. And as always, we continued our work with children.
Jack 20. Isn't that cute?
Now, yeah, okay.
Our research has been
I did it again, sorry. So I just want to revisit the underlying ideas. Procedural thinking, debugging, project-based learning, talking about what you're doing, and having objects to play with, and anthropomorphic thinking, which Seymour later called body syntonic. It was too big a phrase for me. Anthropomorphic thinking wasn't. I don't know. Now, here's Seymour. This is, wait a second. Oh, yes, we're visiting that. Okay. Seymour is going to sum up.
The spirit of logo is to produce a language that encourages an attitude of taking it and changing it, shaping it to yourself. That is true of the individual, it's also true of cultures. And this is where I see a hope for a different kind of relationship between cultures. I don't want to come across as a computer utopian. I think this is a very, very powerful instrument that can change the way people think, the way people develop very profoundly. I think it could go for good or for bad. And in fact, I think that all the forces are such that the path of least resistance is to produce scarily, very scary effects on the way children will develop. I tend more and more to avoid that word education. It makes one think of doing something to the child, educating the child. The total learning environment in which the child grows up includes school, of course, includes those deliberate so-called educational acts that society does on the child. But the most important parts are in relationship, in play, in social forms, in art, in sensibility to aesthetics. All this is part of the developing individual, and the computer enters into all of that. And the great thing about the computer is that it can bring together in one experience the aesthetic, the personal, the bodily, the analytic, the mathematical, the abstract. All these things happen in one combined, integrated experience. The child making stuff on that screen is following an aesthetic, is doing something socially and culturally meaningful and personally involved, as well as mathematically rich. These are not separated. It's not as if the computer now does one thing and now does the other. Like real life situations, like the baby's relationship to the toys or to the mother, it has all these dimensions integrated into one experience. And this is where it leads to a fundamental change in the nature of the learning.
Well, I want to just tell you a couple of things that I find very exciting. One of them is that, well, you see, I did it again, is Marvin Minsky wrote 6 education essays. And when you read them, you will see why Marvin and Seymour were so simpatico, because he brings up a lot of the thinking that Seymour was attributed to, and some concrete examples of a different sort. This book is coming out in September. I edited it with Xiao Xiao, a recent Media Lab graduate, and there she is in Marvin's living room. Marvin's in the distance watching her. But the other thing, which is I'm very pleased to tell you, is when you leave here, you will receive, if you wish, a copy of this little booklet. And what this booklet is called When Computers Were New, Logo, a computer culture created for children. The cover design was made by Artemis Papert, sitting over here. And it consists of 3 papers I wrote with Seymour in the 70s, and 2 I wrote without Seymour, but with lots of comments from him. And these were from 1970 through 1976. And they're very relevant, I think, to thinking about what you want to do with children. And when you teach computer science, it's one thing to teach an AP computer science to students who are going to go on and be computer scientists. But it's quite another thing if you're introducing elementary school children to the brilliant, wonderful experiences they can have programming computers and building things. So I hope you enjoy it, and I'm very grateful that you didn't walk out. My team.